Good evening, everyone. I'm Katie Mediator-Stover, the Director of Reader Services for Kansas City Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight for one of our signature events celebrating Women's History Month, When Women Invented Television with Jennifer Armstrong. Now, I like my job at KCPL, and not for the stereotypical reasons you may think. I do not read all day. Reading is definitely part of my job, and it's one of the best things about my job. But this tonight is the other best thing, meeting authors of books I love and hearing them talk about their books. But if I had to trade jobs with anyone, I'd trade jobs with Jennifer Armstrong. She worked at my favorite magazine, Entertainment Weekly, for over 10 years. I've read her commentary and reviews. She's written 6 other books on television on pop culture, 2 of them on shows I kind of grew up on, The Mickey Mouse Club and Sex and the City. You've probably flipped through Jennifer's most well-known book, The Backstory Behind the Scenes Compendium, Seinfeldia. In her latest book, When Women Invented Television, Jennifer does a deeper dive behind the people and industry that brought us television show business. It should come as no surprise that women were some of the most creative, innovative, and business-savvy members in the early days of television. Yet, as it happens, for some folks, that is the case. It does come as a surprise. I'm sure everyone out there in our own screenland recognizes the name Betty White, but have you heard of Erna Phillips, Hazel Scott, or Gertrude Berg? If you've ever been hooked on a soap opera, you have Erna Phillips to thank. Ever see Alicia Keys play 2 pianos at the same time? Keys saw Hazel Scott do that on her variety show. And every wise, meddling mother on television owes some small debt to Gertrude Berg. Tonight, Jennifer is going to keep the spotlight on these 4 women who made extraordinary contributions to development of the television industry and lasting impacts on how and what we watch now. And if my introduction is all you needed to start reading When Women Invented Television, Jennifer and I hope you order it from bookshop.org or your favorite independent bookstore. If you use bookshop.org, then you know that bookshop.org supports local independent bookstores with every purchase. And tonight, if you're using bookshop.org, please point your purchase to Jennifer's favorite independent bookstore, McNally Jackson Books in New York City. And now, please welcome Jennifer Armstrong.
Thank you for having me.
Jennifer, before we jump into discussing the women in the book, I have to ask you to talk a little bit about this fascination, obsession that we were talking about in the green room with television and popular culture. How did you turn everyone's favorite sport, channel surfing, into a career?
I was really lucky. I will admit that right now. I grew up in a really pop culture centric household. I didn't realize this until, maybe college and beyond, when I met other people who didn't know everything there was to know about pop culture like I did. But there was always records playing or the TV on, or we were going to the movies together. I have a lot of memories with my family of, going to see Raiders of the Lost Ark with my dad, or Sleepless in Seattle with my mom, or watching the Mary Tyler Moore Show with both of them. And we would quote things. And, so this is clearly where it started. TV in particular, I always tell this nerdy story about myself. I was such a nerd. I have many of these, but this is one. When I was a kid, we'd get TV Guide. You'd still get the actual TV Guide in the mail. And we're talking, I'm just like 10 years old or something. We would get it. And what I would do is I'd read all the articles, and then I would go through the whole week and circle all the things I was going to watch that week. And then I was ready. So that just shows you, like, it's not a huge leap to realize that eventually I end up working at Entertainment Weekly, writing articles like those ones. I just remember thinking, like, who gets to do this and why and how? I did go to journalism school, and my early career was actually totally not like this. I was a newspaper reporter, a local newspaper reporter, going to like city council meetings, writing 4 stories a day about the police beat and the city council beat and things like that. But eventually I did make my way to New York City, where I am now, with I remember actually telling my journalism professor in college, when he said, "What's your dream job?" I actually did say, I said Entertainment Weekly or Rolling Stone. And I cannot believe that I actually made it there. It's crazy. I still almost can't believe it. And it was already 10 years ago that I left. But, just kind of through various channels, kept plugging away. And they actually did hire me because of my newspaper career. They loved that I knew how to report, how to actually be a reporter. And from there, kind of worked my way up. And that was a life-changing job for me. I was there for 10 years, like you mentioned. It's where all of my inspiration and work and friends and everything came from. And I'm so, so grateful. I mean, we were just talking about Grey's Anatomy before we started, and I got to be on the set of Grey's Anatomy at its heights, all the time. I was there constantly. Like I was in Hawaii on the set of Lost when Lost was at its peak. I was so, so lucky. And that is really where I started to focus on television, and mostly women in television. And so that kind of starts to lead me toward writing books about television. I had an opportunity essentially to write the book that you mentioned about the Mickey Mouse Club. And that was when I first realized, like, oh, what if you could write a whole book about one show? Like, it's a biography, but it's about a show. And from there, I wrote books about the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Seinfeld, and Sex and the City. And here we are. So, and I had always wanted to be an author, really, in the grand scheme of things. What I really wanted was to write books. So I finally got to sort of marry those two aspects of myself.
That sounds so fascinating and so lucky. I'm so envious that you got to be on the set for Lost and Grey's Anatomy.
It was
I would have lost it if I were there. I loved Lost so much. That was so good. It was such a brain bender.
It really was. It really was. I was there right before they opened the hatch. It was really exciting.
Everybody out there watching knows exactly which episode I'm talking about. So for your book, though, When Women Invented Television, it couldn't have been easy to narrow down the list. So tell us how you came to this subject and these women in particular, because I'm sure there were many women who could have held a place between these covers.
Absolutely. And the point of the book was actually to show that there was this time between 1948 and 1955 when women did a lot more than you might think, and then that it is remembered. And what happened was I stumbled on this little piece of history because I was working on my book about the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted. And whenever I do a book about a show, I find I generally have to go back at least a good 20 years in TV history to kind of understand what led up to it, right? And why it was a big deal. And there were two things that happened in that research that kind of piqued my interest, and then I filed them away until years later. And those two things were, one was that I asked the creators of the show, James L. Brooks and Alan Burns, about the inspirations for the character of Rhoda, who was Mary's best friend and was also overtly Jewish. And they named a number of big Jewish characters from both literature and television in the past. And one of the influences that came up was Gertrude Berg. And I just thought, I have no idea who that is. I don't know what that is. And so they told me a little bit, then I Googled it later, and I got fascinated instantly because she was incredibly famous at this time. She really had the first successful family sitcom. And you cannot overstate. It's like, there's many ways I can tell you. She was voted the most trusted woman in America after Eleanor Roosevelt. She had a line of house dresses. She had a cookbook that was successful. She had a column where she gave motherly advice. This show was the first show that was so successful on television, it was made into a movie. Like, everyone knew. I even interviewed someone who worked with her on the movie, who played a young woman in the movie at the time, and she is still with us. And I asked, did you know who Gertrude Berg was when you were going to do the movie? And she said, oh, honey, everybody knew who Gertrude Berg was. So that just tells you, like, this woman was incredibly famous, and I didn't know. I had never heard of her. So that was the first thing that kind of, like, I filed away in my head. And the second thing from the Mary Tyler Moore Show research was that we were talking about the character that Betty White played on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which was Sue Ann Nivens, the happy homemaker. She, great character and great performance. She was this character who had, like, a homemaking show on the station where Mary worked. And she was this very sweet, sort of sickly sweet character in front of the camera and wore these frilly dresses. And the minute the camera went off, she was a different person. She was cutting and mean and hilarious. And so the first part of that character, the sickly sweet part, what they said is before we even cast Betty, we had described her in the script as a Betty White type. And I thought, I have no idea what you mean. I didn't know her until the 70s and this character. So I was like, what is that? And so I looked it up, and it did turn out this was really a joke about her character from the 40s and 50s when she would be on, she was on a Los Angeles daytime talk show. And she indeed was just the sweetest thing. And that was kind of her deal. And you liked it or you didn't, but that was the way it was. And she did wear these frilly dresses with high necklines. And so it really, I was like, how interesting. And that one really led me to actually kind of do a little more research and reading about TV at that time. And I did start bumping into all of these women doing things. And I thought, wow, I had no idea. And that was really how I came to this idea. And then from there made a gigantic list where I then started to narrow down. And throughout the book, I mention a number of other women in like a paragraph or two, just to at least, give a nod to them. So there were lots of women who I didn't quite make it into the narrative. I thought 4 was about right. I went with the Sex and the City rule and the Golden Girls rule that, a foursome is about what we can handle. And you have I wanted different experiences of that. And I wanted to show, I figured if I could get the 4 different experiences from these women, it would kind of show the whole picture. So I had, Betty White and Irna Phillips, who worked in daytime. And I had Hazel Scott and Gertrude Berg, who worked in primetime. I had Hazel and Gertrude, who worked in New York, and Betty, who was working in Los Angeles. They all had different family situations. Betty was very, very single. The other, Hazel and Gertrude were married with children. Erna was unmarried, but had adopted 2 children on her own. So I was kind of trying to like show in different genres. And so there were women like Faye Emerson, who had a hugely successful nighttime talk show. Which I think that's shocking too, just because we don't know, we know about Milton Berle, for instance, Mr. Television, and he's fine, but it's crazy to me that we know his name so well this far out, but we don't know women like that. Or Amanda Randolph, who was a Black woman who had her own talk show in daytime, and also was actually the first, I believe I'm getting this right, the first Black woman to be the star of a sitcom. So, there's a lot of women who worked behind the scenes, in front of the camera, all of that stuff. But I wanted to show the complete experience and also really have 4 women who very much contributed to their genre, who actually, I wanted to call it When Women Invented Television. So I wanted them all to have some sense of that invention in their career.
Sorry. Let's go back to Gertrude Berg then. And I'm going to ask the picture to come back up and talk to us about Gertrude's contributions to TV, because you said that she was a household name. She was a business conglomerate. Martha Stewart probably took cues from Gertrude Berg.
Exactly. I think of Martha and Oprah when I think of her. Very much ahead of her time. All these women were in their own ways. She was a workhorse, first of all. This woman loved to work. She loved what she did. She lived for, especially this character, Molly Goldberg, quintessential Jewish mother character. She created her for radio and was actually on the radio with the Goldbergs, her show, which by the way is no relation to the current sitcom, The Goldbergs. The Goldbergs was on for 17 years on the radio. And what I love about this is this woman looked at that and said, that's not enough for me. She had kind of just wound down at what I call kind of a sitcom lifetime, right? You have children on a sitcom. They eventually grow up and move out of the house. She had lived a sitcom lifetime and then some. She actually did a Broadway version briefly right after it ended because she did not want it to end on the radio. And then TV was coming up. And so she really used Broadway as this dry run because she had such vision. She saw that there was something going to happen over in that TV world. And this is like 1948. So she just thought, my God, I can reboot this thing, to speak in modern terms. I can start this over and start out with, with a preteen and a teenager on my show and do a whole other sitcom lifetime. And so at the age of 50, having had incredible success already, she just used that power. And basically, I start my book with this, but she kind of marched into the office of CBS. And William Paley, the head of CBS, and said, and this was a powerful man. He was the guy at the time. She marched right in there and she said, I think I deserve a spot on your television network. I got you through the Depression on radio and you owe me. And he thought about it for a little while. She had actually been rejected by all the other networks, including him once. And she was not taking that. She was not taking no for an answer. So she demanded this and he said, all right, let's try it. And that is how the Goldbergs started. So and this is very this is the kind of thing that goes on for her over and over throughout her career. She really was so dedicated to work and to this character, I think, in particular. And in some ways, it eventually turned out to be somewhat of a downfall for her that she was so dedicated to this. But really just such a powerful woman and knew it and was not afraid to use this, especially behind the scenes. In public, she really presented this image of America's mother. Behind the scenes, she loved to dress beautifully. She did not cook, and yet she put out a line of house dresses that would cost like $1.50 and had a successful cookbook. So, she was also a master of her image.
Goldbergs isn't a show that I recall seeing as a kid in constant reruns. So Can you tell us a little bit about her show? What was the premise, and were you able to interview any of the actors from the show?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do they remember about her?
So the Goldbergs was about a family living in a Jewish family living in a Bronx tenement. And that's kind of it. That's why this is the quintessential, one of the first family sitcoms. And if you watch the early episodes, that is what you would call it. That's what you recognize it as. It really sets that up. So, the classic kind of, we're in the living room, cute problems happen, mom helps to solve them in 20 to 30 minutes, And the big hallmarks of the show, just to give you a visual sense, first of all, these are live shows. So they would do this live, even though it's a scripted sitcom. That's just the way television worked. That's the technology of the time. So it makes for some madcap kind of things that they need to do. It's very by the seat of your pants DIY. She would have to wear like 3 dresses layered and run out, take a dress off. She's got a new one on. It's a new day in the next scene. She had this signature that she started on radio, but people went absolutely crazy for on television, which is she had one of the first TV catchphrases. The tenements, there was a window in their apartment and it looked out on an air shaft, and she would lean out the window and yell, "Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Bloom." And the neighbor would come out, pop her head out the window, and we would see them gossip at the window. And yoo-hooing was a big thing. Sometimes the TV husband, he would be like, Molly, they're yoo-hooing for you. It was like their telephone system. So that was a really big, people knew that. And the other thing she did that was really incredible is she would deliver the ads in character. She wrote them herself. So Sanka Coffee was her first sponsor. And these ads are riveting. I am telling you, it's like my favorite part of the show. She would start out at the window in the beginning of the show, and she'd just start telling you a story in her character's voice, which was very natural. Sometimes she'd stutter a little, all of this stuff. And you'd think I don't know where she's going with this. She'd start telling a story about we went to the Catskills to try to get away. Everybody there, was really tired though. They weren't sleeping well. They were very irritable. And you're thinking like, what is she doing? And then she'd be like, I told them about Sanka coffee, which is decaffeinated instant coffee. 95% of the sleep, or 95% of the caffeine is taken out, but the sleep is left in. And then she'd turn around and start her shit. Like she'd turn around to her family. They would have been bustling around back behind her. And she'd just start, from there, she would turn right around. And often she would link even the story from the Sanka commercial right into, okay, we just got back from the Catskills. We're all, unpacking now. And this was a huge hit. She sold incredible amounts of Sanka, and this too, just enhanced her power in these early days.
I think you just solved a home mystery for me. Why was there so much Sanka in my house when I was a kid? I'm pretty certain that's where it came from. I'm pretty certain my grandmother is the one that brought it over.
Yeah, well, the sleep is left in. So that's all you need to know. 95% of the caffeine is removed and the sleep is left in.
Oh, and those coffee crystals, I remember those too.
Oh, yes.
All right, we're showing our age. We don't want to do that. So let's move on to the next character. I was just gobsmacked at how beautiful the Hazel Scott is and how talented, and her story is heartbreaking and inspiring. And I was enamored that Alicia Keys paid homage to Hazel Scott. So please tell us about Hazel's show and what is she doing in this photo? And she's just amazing. Her famous first.
She really, really is. I keep describing her as the Beyonce of her day for a number of reasons. Look at how glamorous she is. This dress, I can't everything. The looks were always on point. This woman knew how to put herself together. She is beautiful. She was a big star, and she had a couple of big tricks that she did that people really loved as a jazz performer. One is this: she would play two pianos at once. And like you said, Alicia Keys did this a few years ago when she hosted the Emmys. And I was so excited because I was already writing this book. I was screaming and like running around the apartment going, I just want to tell someone, she just said Hazel Scott, which I just loved. And the other thing that Hazel did is she swung the classics. So she would start out playing like a traditional Bach song or whatever. And then as it went on, she'd kind of make it jazzier and super cool. And this is, the height of jazz at the time. So people love this. She was selling out concert halls across the country, using her platform to advance civil rights was a big issue for her. And so, for instance, she would not play segregated venues. She would walk out. If she walked in and saw the red carpet down the middle, separating the two sides, she'd walk right back out. And she would give, interviews then and say, I don't know why someone would want to pay to see someone who looks like me play, but wouldn't want to sit next to someone who looks like me. So she was this great figure and advocate and really used her platform for that. Another big thing about her is that she was married to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a congressman from Harlem who was his own gigantic star. I mean, very charismatic, gorgeous, debonair. He was a preacher. They had met in Harlem. She saw him preach. He saw her perform. It was all on. And they actually had kind of a scandalous beginning because he was still married at the time. So all of this just adds to their mystique, right? I mean, they were in Ebony magazine all the time. There's one incredible cover story about them where it's like a beautiful photo of them with their son Skipper at the time. And the headline is My Life with Hazel Scott by Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And he wrote all about how wonderful their lives were together. She cooks, she makes chocolate cake, she plays the piano, she's gorgeous. It was that kind of thing. So that's why I think of her as kind of the Beyonce of her day. And naturally, for all of those reasons, the Dumont Network, which was the fourth network at the time, offered her the chance to have her own variety show in primetime. And so she had the show. First, it was just in New York City where she lived. And she loved this because she could finally stay home with her son most of the time instead of traveling all over the country to perform. And it was so popular, it expanded to multiple nights a week in New York. And then finally, it expanded nationally, and it actually made her the first Black person to have a primetime show that was national. And this was 1950. So really big deal. And, mention segregation. This is still Jim Crow South. This is still an incredible time to be making this kind of breakthrough. And unfortunately, it burns bright and fast because she ran into the blacklist, the Hollywood blacklist. She was listed in this publication named Red Channels that claimed to be telling you who might be a communist. They didn't say they were. They said, these people might be, do what you want. And she, as you sort of alluded to, I think heroically volunteered to go before the House Un-American Activities Committee because she thought she could clear her name by doing this. But really what she was doing is standing up for what was right. And she really gave this incredible rousing speech. She was very good with words. And it's hard to overstate, this Black woman going before these white men in power and explaining to them what they're doing wrong. And she's completely right. And really just, it's such an incredible story. And unfortunately, I want it to be different. I want the movie to go differently and to have everyone rally behind her and go like, we can't take this anymore. Let's boycott everyone who fires people because of, possible implied communist ties. But instead, she goes back home to New York and kind of soon afterwards is very unceremoniously fired. I mean, they don't really say it that way. They can't find a sponsor all of a sudden for her show. It goes off the air. And she was very disillusioned and moved to Paris not that long afterwards because she felt like there were a number of Black American expatriates in Paris at the time, like James Baldwin, and she felt like the reception there was much better for her. And so I think that all goes a long way toward telling us why we maybe don't know her name and certainly don't know her contribution to television, because those tapes are lost. We can't find the recordings. And that is just a travesty.
I'm rolling back just a little bit to ask, did her husband, Congressman Powell, was he any help, or was that a bit of a hindrance in that situation?
I suspect it was a hindrance. I suspect it all goes together. You can't prove any of these things with this stuff, including the firing, right? They tried to sue later, and it was so hard to prove definitively what caused what. Her husband, as her son tells it anyway, she came home and said, I'm going to go talk to them. And he was like, please don't, because he knew what was going to happen. But she really couldn't stand by, which I think is so admirable. He had a number of enemies in Congress, I think for overtly racial reasons. And, I have a story in the book that they found out they were being wiretapped when they were, going abroad for his trips. They found out their own FBI was wiretapping them, which was a very common practice. They did this to Martin Luther King Jr. too. So I think that it probably contributed. It probably made her a target in addition to they did a lot of civil rights work together. And, she is also just a Black woman. And then she's got this TV show too, in addition to being in music. And they were really coming for TV at that time because they were obviously already scared of the power that TV was going to have. And what really started to happen was that this list came out, and then a woman named Jean Muir got successfully fired from a show that she was on because she was on the list. And once that happened, there was sort of this free for all of who can we figure out how to get rid of next? And so the advertisers were very emboldened to demand that these suspected communists be fired.
That's terrible. Advertising just deciding, nope, we don't like your politics. Doesn't matter that your show is going through the roof in the ratings.
Which is crazy. The business of this, I actually don't understand. And the only explanation I have is hysteria, because the business end makes no sense, right? She's doing great. So why would you do that, except that it's emotional, it's racism and sexism. and fear all freaking out all of a sudden. I mean, we didn't talk about this yet, but basically a messier version of this, not messier, for the person, but messier in terms of more complicated version of this happens to Gertrude Berg. Her TV husband, Philip Loeb, was on the same list with Hazel Scott. And General Foods, who made Sanka, loved her commercials. Her commercials were revolutionary, but all of a sudden, they demanded she fire Philip Loeb, and she refused at first. And this kept the show off the air right when it was hitting its peak. It had just had its movie version happen, all of this stuff. It was supposed to come back in the fall and be paired with this new show called I Love Lucy. And instead, it got pulled off the air, again, very unceremoniously, when it was in the top 10. They said it was for budgetary reasons, but when I looked at the budgets, it was very similar budget-wise to less popular shows of its kind. And, really that broke the momentum of her show and of her career. So she was off the air for a while. She was able to get it back on the air on NBC a little bit later, but still ended up having to fire Philip Loeb or stop the show altogether. And all of those things, it's like they were off the air for a while. And then I believe, having watched the show, she and Philip Loeb had that special chemistry that we recognize in, TV stars, will they, won't they types TV stars now. They were really special. They seemed like a married couple. They seemed really lived in and had a connection. And so then she ends up replacing him twice because he's so hard to replace. The first one doesn't stick. The second one, he's fine, but I don't like the later episodes with him nearly as much as I like the early episodes with Philip Loeb. And so altogether, this is why I think we don't know, not everyone knows about Gertrude Berg either. And similar to Hazel, the recordings of the show, they do exist, but especially the early versions, which are the best, the early episodes, which are the best ones, they're a very bad version. They're kind of like a copy of a copy. So I think that's why we see like an I Love Lucy in endless reruns, because this is getting nerdy now, but they shot on film for I Love Lucy, whereas the Goldbergs was still live. And so it was just a bad copy of the show. And so I believe that this is a huge, factor in the end of Lucy is a legend, and she should be, and she was a genius. But I also think they made this critical decision to shoot on film, and thus preserve themselves into the streaming era even.
They didn't even think about that. I bet that's something that crossed Gertrude's mind at some point. She seems so, Gertrude and Hazel, both so innovative. And it's almost as if their innovation, their drive and their independence is what the industry didn't like to see, even though the industry benefited so much from it.
Oh, completely. And I mean, there are known kind of correlations too between the blacklist and working women, in addition to the obvious factor, which is that we have a Black woman and a Jewish woman. So I think it's fascinating too that they went after Gertrude's TV husband. I mean, part of it is just that he had the right resume, as it were. If you hung out in certain places, they could kind of go after you. So he and Hazel actually both hung out at a place called Cafe Society, where Hazel played, and was a real lefty hangout, and that actually got shut down by the blacklist. But also he was a big labor activist, so they could go after him. But I also think it was an interesting way to go after Gertrude, right? Because she was so popular and beloved. What if we kind of just go at her from the side here and demand that this lady listen to us and do what we say and get rid of this guy and see if it works, And I really think that all of those factors came into play there.
Women in power can be scary.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about Erna Phillips, who is my favorite out of this book, and you know why. Her contributions to soap operas, but she's amazing, and she's quiet, and or not quiet, but this is a name I did not know until I encountered it in your book. I could see where I might have learned a little bit about Hazel Scott and Gertrude Berg in my classes in communications, but not Erna Phillips. What did she do with her life that turned it into TV gold?
She is I mean, I feel like I say this at all. I'm like, what a powerhouse. And she's my only woman who was really just behind the scenes. She was not in front of the camera. She invented the daytime soap opera. She did it for radio because her bosses asked her to make something to, sell stuff to women. And it's all comes, notice what we keep coming back to, the ads, right? That's what it all comes down to in both radio and television. And so she made these little domestic dramas. That was what she came up with. She, by the way, did not like the term soap opera till, her entire life. She used serial as it's a serialized drama. That's what it is. And it was called soap operas because they wanted to sell soap to the ladies. And it was a denigrating term. And I can tell you, she endured lots of bad reviews. And I'm not saying that because she was bad at her job. I'm saying because it was men writing reviews about this stuff. And they were all like, what's with these whiny women with their problems at home? And she, did some really key things that we would still recognize in terms of the form. It's like the dramatic organ cues for when there's drama, right? And the dramatic pause. She loved a dramatic pause and was often demanding that her writers and directors use more dramatic pauses, which I love. And also just really key use of cliffhangers, which you and I were talking about, Shonda Rhimes before this. And I think of that, and I think of just anything we watch on Netflix now when we binge watch, how we're so dependent on that cliffhanger. That's how she kept her audience coming back day after day in the daytime. And so she was very good at knowing her audience. She knew things down to like, you have to tell the story at a certain pace because the women might be doing their housework while watching, and you don't want to like make it so dependent on just seeing it that they'll miss something. And she brought the form from radio to television. She actually had the first daytime soap opera ever on television, which was called These Are My Children, which is no relation to All My Children. That was a flop, but it was the first one. And so we learn along the way. And then eventually came back with a very successful idea, which was she brought her massive hit radio soap opera, it was The Guiding Light at the time. And I love this detail of this. They brought it to TV in this very specific way, which was they kept the show right going. They kept it, just the plot line just kept going from radio to TV, and then it was simulcast on radio and television. So you could listen to the actors doing it or see them for a time. And that was how she kind of had this really big hit, to the point where it lasted until not that long ago and was the longest running broadcast show in history because it actually predated television and, in radio, and then came to television. So she then went on to have lots of other successful shows and mentored lots of people who went into the same business, went into soap operas as well. So she almost kind of had her fingerprints on most shows in daytime soaps at one point. So she is just another one where really incredibly successful, and was doing this while raising two children that she adopted on her own as a single woman.
Did she work any of her own life into her serialized drama plots?
She sure did. This is another really big thing that I think is an actual contribution to the genre, if you think about it, the adoption plot line. She was constantly going to her own experience with adoption in a million different ways, whether it was the surprise reveal, you're adopted, or the surprise reveal of this is your real father. She had so many different variations on this. She had one that was kind of heartbreaking, where she had a teenage character who said something like, if I ever meet my birth mother, I'm going to kill her. And I believe it is that she ends up doing it in the show. Her daughter had said something like that to her. Her kids were often acting out and using the adoption against her. And she felt very guilty about her mothering, and at one point said that she actually regretted adopting her children. She was very, very concerned about the fact that she could not give them a father. And this haunted her. And so another thing that she did in her soaps where this really came out, where there was this interplay, is that she started deliberately making strong male characters. She had started out with really strong women in her early shows. Some of her early radio stuff was just women. And eventually in the 50s, interestingly enough, along with the rest of the country as it goes super patriarchal, she really took it in and felt guilty and started saying, I'm going to write strong men and strong marriages because I feel personally responsible for the rising divorce rate, and also that I think there needs to be more strong male role models in the world because she wasn't able to give that to her kids, and especially her son. That really haunted her. And so she really worked out a lot of stuff in her own work.
Wow. Tell me she's not the one who gave us Amnesia and Evil Twin.
That was going on. I mean, it was in the ether. I'm not sure if she did, but it was already in the ether on like the radio stuff. They were already talking about the ridiculous, it's interesting though, just as a touch point on this, when she started these, they were very grounded. It was like very normal stuff at first. It was, can I borrow your dress for this wedding I have to be in? And what shoes am I going to wear? And does this man love me? And this sort of thing. They were often set in boarding houses, and that's how she would have women who were not necessarily related interacting with each other. And then I think what happened is quickly, if you're doing a daily show, you start to realize like, I got to snap this up. And so they start to really escalate. And something she did actually bring to the genre is the idea of having like doctors and lawyers. She was very into she was into both actually. And she had a lot of doctors and lawyers in her own life. So I think this is telling. But she actually is a contributor to something like Grey's Anatomy in the sense that she saw how if you had a doctor, like on The Guiding Light, she had a pastor. So what that allowed was people could come to the pastor with problems. And that made more sense that they were having constant dramatic problems because they were coming to him with problems. And same thing with something like a doctor. Of course, they see stuff because they're a doctor. So she kind of brought this idea of the professional as a conduit of drama.
That just makes me think about some of my favorite Shonda shows in a totally different light.
Exactly.
Well, I saved, I think, what some folks will consider the best for last to ask you about Betty White. And all of us who think about Betty White now, the first thing we think about is Betty White, the feisty senior citizen. She just turned 100, and her Snicker bar football commercials they're comedy gold. But look at this beautiful, vibrant woman who was a lot sharper than that Sue Ann character you were telling me about.
Yes, and she was not mean. That is the part that was not based on her at all. I swear to God, I've never heard anyone say anything, thank God, bad about Betty White. And I have talked to her, and she is as delightful as you want her to be. But yes, she was the hot young thing in the early 50s. I mean, I really loved reading these feature stories on her at the time that really were saying that, this is one young woman to watch. Her comedy timing is pretty good, that kind of thing. And she was just incredible. So she was, as I mentioned, she was doing this talk show in Los Angeles at first called Hollywood on Television, where she and her co-host, Al Jarvis, were on the air 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week, ad-libbing it up, doing whatever they felt like. Sometimes it was sketches. Sometimes they'd talk about the news. They just banter with each other. They also had to deliver all of their commercials for those 5.5 hours. Can you imagine? And she liked to memorize her commercials. So that was the one part that would be a little scripted. And so she's out there, vacuuming stuff up to show you about this vacuum or, all these kinds of crazy things. It's really fascinating. But from there, one of their sketches really caught on, and she spun it off into a sitcom called Life with Elizabeth. And it is delightful. You can find some clips of it on YouTube, and what a treat. She's there from the beginning, man. These are just very silly little plot lines. It's really just they'd have this announcer come on and he'd say like, incident number 1 in Life with Elizabeth. And then it was her and her TV husband. That's it. It was this duo. And they would occasionally have like maybe 1 or 2 guest stars, but it was very tight. It was small. And often they would do 2 or 3 setups in 1.5 hour. So they'd do these like 10-minute almost sketches. And it would just be like, Elizabeth's gonna learn how to drive, but she doesn't want to tell Alvin, you know, like that kind of very sitcom-y type of thing. And she is hilarious. And there's kind of this gambit they do that's really a signature thing where the announcer will talk directly to her through the camera and be like, Elizabeth, you know, what do you think you're doing now? And she wouldn't talk to him, but she'd like gesture. And his signature line was, he'd say, Elizabeth, aren't you ashamed? And then she'd go, and it is just the cutest thing. It's so cute. Totally recommend. So at one point she had this and Life, you know, she had the talk show and Life with Elizabeth going, which is an insane schedule. And then the talk show ended because she was actually offered the chance to have a national talk show of her own, the Betty White Show. And that was 1954. And so she was really like, you know, there were all these stories that were like, America's sweetheart is here and it's Betty White and you should pay attention to her. And one of my favorite things, I mentioned her frilly dresses, but she was known particularly for her high necklines because she wanted to be very sweet and demure. Similarly to Gertrude Berg, she was very clear on managing her own image and took some flack for it sometimes. I read some mean sexist reviews of her show and that sort of thing, where the men seemed basically a little disappointed that she wasn't, you know, trying to seduce them at all times. And, you know, people would kind of make fun of her a little bit for being so sweet and insipid and all that stuff. But I think she is just charming when I watch these old clips. She sang songs, you guys. She wanted to be a singer. She had actually started out wanting to be an opera singer. So she doesn't sing as much as she used to, but she really sang a lot back in those days. That was a thing people did on TV. And yeah, she is just absolutely dripping with charm in these old clips and was really this already at that time, really a powerhouse and also very shrewd about image management. You know, she dealt a lot with constant questions. Why are you single? Why don't you want kids? You know, we're getting into the mid 50s at that point. Everyone is suspicious of that. She was actually divorced twice before this and was living back with her parents after the 2 marriages. She didn't bring it up in interviews. She would just say, I just don't have time for a husband right now. And very smart, right? I just want to give my full attention to him when I find him. But first, I have these shows to do. And she did talk a little bit about, you know, no one would ever ask a man, why are you working so hard instead of being married? So this is what I'm doing right now. And she was actually pretty avowed. At that time, she was like, I'm never going to get married because I love my career too much. And she felt like she had to choose between the 2 at the time. She later did get married and had one of the great Hollywood marriages to Al Ludden. She has a lot of Alvins and Als and things in her life. But she had this great marriage later on, but she really at this time was like, absolutely not. She was really clear on what she wanted and didn't want.
I'm going to take a moment to see if there's a couple of questions here. Oh, there is. What ground still remains to be broken by women in TV today? Most of the directing, for example, is still being done by men, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we still have plenty of room for improvement, though things are certainly better than they used to be. There's just so much opportunity in streaming. I think the big challenge now is the numbers are a lot bigger because I don't know if you guys have noticed during the pandemic, especially, there is a lot of television to watch. It's just constant. And so that's great. And that has opened up so many more avenues. So I always say now, like, isn't it great how there isn't just 1 or 2 women's shows, which I think was how it was. I mean, even something like Sex and the City, I feel like was still supposed to be, here's the ladies show, all the ladies watch this, right? And it's like, well, no, that's about 4 rich, thin white women in a very specific, you know, situation. A lot of people liked it, but it wasn't representing a lot of voices. Now we have tons of voices. The problem is that you're never going to have that kind of hit again where lots and lots of people are watching one thing. We have some phenomenon, we've had a little bit of that, but a Schitt's Creek is not the same as, a Sex and the City or it's, it's a little closer, or like a Seinfeld, it's not this big cultural moment. And so it's like there's more women doing stuff, but they're not ever going to have the same power that was sort of concentrated in a different time in television. That's good in some ways because there's something for everyone. But I think we need to get more women in at least the biggest, kind of places that we have these days. I would say Shonda Rhimes is doing it, but I would like more Shonda Rhimeses is what we really,
Yes.
right? Where she's this powerhouse and she can make something like Bridgerton was as close as we're going to get to something like a phenomenon where even if you haven't seen it, what it is. You were forced at some point to be like, okay, what is everyone talking about? Okay, I guess it's the sexy thing with people in a different time. Great, now I know. But that's, I think, more of that level of power, more women in that situation would be the next step, I think.
We've had a question from one of the audience members. Listening to you talk about Gertrude Berg's live improvisation and her comedy timing, what kind of presence do you think she would have had on a show like Saturday Night Live?
Oh, I think of Gertrude Berg in so many different, I'm just like, I wish she were here. It's another one. I recommend for all of these, go watch some clips. You can find those too. And she is really interesting on camera because, she is not a 28-year-old beauty in the way that Betty White was at the time. She was not what we think of as, she was not Jennifer Aniston, but she has this presence that you would not even believe. My God, nobody had a shot against her. And if you read reviews of her work, which I quote a lot in the book, it's very funny because she was, all the reviewers just lost it when they didn't even like her play version of the Goldbergs, but they would all be like, this is kind of a mess, but my God, Gertrude Berg, one of them said something incredible. She actually won a Tony later in her life for a dramatic performance on Broadway. And the reviewer at the time said something like, we are all children when Gertrude Berg is on the stage. And I just thought yep, I can totally see. I was never in her presence, obviously, but just seeing her on the show, it's sort of, she's one of those, it doesn't matter what she did, you just wanted to keep watching. And having seen her she did a number of appearances on Milton Berle. They were really good friends, her and Milton Berle. And she did a lot of appearances, usually in character as Molly Goldberg. And that is the closest we can see to her being on an SNL. And she steals the show from Milton Berle. You don't even know anymore that it's his show. It is hilarious. She completely takes over and just, the camera is on her. And she was such a force. And that's why she was such a success.
I love characters like that. I love actors like that, where they redeem anything they're in. It's just, they elevate everything. And if it's bad, they redeem it.
This is her. I watched some, I was at the Paley Center, the nerdy Paley Center, which I love, where you can watch old clips of stuff that you can't get anywhere else. I watched some stuff. She did these movie of the week. It's essentially, that's the equivalent from the time of these movie of the week type things. And same deal. It's it didn't matter if the script was good. You were just in because she was so, and it really tells you though too, she was so married to this character, Molly Goldberg. I think she could have gone bigger. I think she could have done anything and was kind of doing that when she died at a relatively early age, in her 60s. But she had 2 plays in the works when she died, which I love. One was had already sold out because they were selling tickets, and she was working on another one. So she really had started on this sort of second career as a Broadway star when she died.
That's unfortunate. Hard to think about what it is we might have lost in
talent. I know.
Someone wants to know if you would rank or just give us in any order the 5 most powerful, influential women's characters in television history.
Oh, God, that's so hard. Okay, actually, no, I can do this. I'm going to go to the easy one first, because I wrote a book about it. I'll probably do 2 from my books, cross promotion, but definitely the Mary Tyler Moore. There's no Mary Richards. You can't overstate this in terms of women on television. I mean, you just really can't. I wrote a whole book about her. And the reason is she was so, her singleness, her professional, she's a single professional woman over 30, living her best life right in front of us, making us all want to be her. And this was revolutionary at the time. She wasn't the first single woman. We had that girl before it, which was lovely and super important too. But the fact that she was over 30, the fact that she was very independent, and really as the show went on was not even interested in dating. She dated, but that was not the end game. It was really about her professional life and, making her way alone. So she is just, you cannot overstate it. And when I was at Entertainment Weekly, I was often talking to women like Tina Fey, Mindy Kaling, that sort of thing. And everyone cited her as their influence. You just can't get past that. Probably Lucille Ball, can't get past that either. I mean, my book sort of is all about a reaction to her, right? My book is basically saying she wasn't the only one, but you know a lot about her. So I'll let you read about her elsewhere. I'm going to tell you about these women, but she is the influence on someone like Mary and going forward. And probably the reason that women could do things in television. Like, this is a woman who produced and starred in her show, right? And then I would say, let's see, trying to think. It gets harder as you go forward for the exact reasons I was talking about. You don't have these mass hits anymore. But, I think Sex and the City was big. I think Carrie Bradshaw was big. She's a female anti-hero, among other things, and kind of made it so that women could be super flawed, not just cute how she stumbles sometimes, right? But very, very flawed character. I'm gonna go Claire Huxtable. I know we don't like to talk about the show anymore, but this is, you just cannot deny. 80s sitcom moms, queen of the 80s sitcoms moms. Also just seeing Felicia Rashad, she's still out there doing stuff all the time. And every time, I think she's the star of the show. I really do. I think she takes it. And then I'm trying to think of a current, ish, in the last 20 years. You could talk about Tina Fey. It sort of becomes more of a panoply, right? It's Tina Fey, Grey's Anatomy, oh my God, Scandal. She was pretty, that's Olivia Pope is pretty big there, I would say.
So unlikably lovable.
What a mess. Mess in a good way. You know what I'm talking about. What a crazy show. That was oh God. And even, I'm just throwing stuff out there now, but Issa Rae, Insecure, Michaela Cole, I May Destroy You this year. I think we don't really, that one to me, that shook me. I was watching that show. I don't know if people have seen it. It's a lot. So it's intense, and it's okay if you don't want to watch it too. But this HBO show over the summer that was sometimes comedy, sometimes drama, really dark, and was about a woman dealing with her sexual assault and the aftermath. And it's incredible. It's riveting. And what I kept thinking, because I was writing the book while reading it or watching it, and I just kept thinking, my God, this would blow those women's minds. They would, if they could know, I think they'd love it. But if they could know this was where TV was going to go, not just the streaming factor, but the fact that women could do this kind of thing and tell this kind of story on the medium they were in, I think that would really blow their minds. And how incredible that Betty White has been there for the whole thing.
So we've got a question that's a little bit off topic, but one of our viewers wants to hear your take on how Kamala Harris has been portrayed on television. Are the news and entertainment shows, are they doing an acceptable job of covering the first Black woman to serve as our vice president?
I've enjoyed the SNL. The SNL thing is the main thing I think of course, and it's Maya Rudolph, who is perfect. And I really have enjoyed that depiction from the beginning. I feel like it's a little bit, it takes us back old school a little bit in SNL impressions in terms of, I don't think they're trying to like very deeply comment on her, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think they feel an urge to necessarily undercut her. I'm glad, you know, that's really good. I think they're like, she's, the main joke is sort of like, she's very glamorous and in charge. And I loved the joke they did once that was basically she said something like, you know, that she had been sort of made for an NBC legal drama. And she like looked at the camera and they had her hair blowing. And I always think of that because that's so accurate, but it's a correctly gentle portrayal. And I think that that's really good. It's respectful. And, you know, I mean, I think we've all heard of incidents where the news coverage has gone less than well. But I think a lot of places also are still treading pretty lightly. So we'll see how it goes, but it'll be interesting. I think when we get further along too, we get to a point, this is really weird, but you always get to a point with administrations where eventually they're going to start being portrayed. Do you know what I mean? There's going to be like an HBO movie. We're probably going to start to see this with the Trump administration. And you know, doing the sort of in retrospect, as we start to tell it as history, I think that will be extremely interesting too.
You said something just a moment ago that set my brain spinning. But when I think about the TV shows that you and I were talking about before we started, and the women that you're talking about in this book, and even the women that you referenced in your previous books, you talked about being respectful. And while these women were certainly capable of pushing the envelope, they always did it with some measure of mindfulness and respectfulness of their topics, of their characters, of themselves. And Maya Rudolph is being respectful in her portrayal of Kamala Harris, whereas, you know, there might be elements of the news where they're not, and we know there are news shows where they're not. But is that something intrinsic to the way women work in mass media? Is that a good quality? Is it a bad quality? Is it just a quality with good side, bad side?
I mean, it's probably a good quality. I'm like into respect. You know what I mean? Like, yes, of course, you stand up for yourself and justice and all of those things. Like Hazel's a great example, right? Because I don't think she was ever disrespectful in the way that I would describe it. And, you know, maybe some of the white men felt that she was, but I would not describe her that way. I think she was actually, I talk about this in the book a lot. She was very, very conscious of the way she portrayed herself. And often if she could influence the way other Black women were portrayed. There's a huge incident in her career when she stops work on a movie she was doing called The Heat's On, where she had a scene where she was playing this military song, The Caissons Go Rolling Along. She was in a military uniform, like a women's, you know, auxiliary uniform. She looked great, but there were dancers, they were all Black women in her scene, and they came out in their costumes that they were given and they were dirty aprons. And she said, no, that's not happening in my scene. I will not come back to work until this is fixed. She shut the production down for days, which is a lot of money. And that is not something that they enjoyed a lot. Harry Kahn, who was in charge of the studio there, told her she'd never work in movies again as long as he was alive. And it was true. But she got what she wanted. They finally gave in and gave them these floral dresses. So that just tells you she had a big thing. She would not play what she called singing maid roles. She always had to be credited as herself. She had wardrobe approval. So she was very conscious. And I think this is a way of being that is both respectful, but also having boundaries. And similarly, I think they were all very conscious in their own ways. Gertrude's thinking about how I'm portraying a Jewish family. She's also was thinking about, for instance, when she would have like a Black guest star on, how she was portraying them in her script. So I do think, and you know, Betty thought about this too, both with herself and she had a man named Arthur Duncan on her show, a dancer who was Black, and she brought him over. She had kind of known him from LA, and she brought him to her national show. And going national is different. You're going, you know, you're suddenly going to be in the Jim Crow South too. And so she got nasty letters and did not back down from that. And so I think that probably as people who felt somewhat marginalized, they could always think about other people who might be marginalized too, and they were also probably respectful, because that was, otherwise they were going to just get ousted if they were not respectful of, unfortunately, the white men who were in charge. But so I think there's a little bit of that there, but I think most of them were pretty skillful in trying to like stand up for what they thought was right while trying to navigate this. It works sometimes, not other times.
So we've been at this for a little more than an hour, and I'll close it out by asking you to tell us about a piece of research. And I know that you did so much research for this book. You must have found 400 women that could fit in this book. But can you tell us something that you had to leave out about any of the characters? An interesting story about Erna, Hazel, Gertrude, or Betty?
Honestly, the thing that comes to mind is that I really went down this other road with Philip Loeb, who was blacklisted, who was Gertrude's blacklisted husband, TV husband. And part of that was that actually Gertrude didn't talk a lot about him once she had to fire him. It was very painful both to let him go, and actually we didn't talk about this, and it is sad, and I'm sorry to end on this note, but he actually killed himself in 1955. He took an overdose of sleeping pills. So he died by suicide, and was kind of known as, recognized as a suicide that was due to the blacklist. And she really did not talk about this. And one can understand why. So I was trying to figure out what happened, essentially, what the details were, and some of them were available, but I ended up going into his archive and looking through his letters as well. And he was so funny. He was funny and very dirty. They did not allow that on the Goldbergs, but he had a dirty sense of humor. And if anyone is old school and knows who Zero Mostel is, big Broadway star, and also sometimes film in the 60s, just really fun guy, really a big man, big presence. And they were best friends. And so I also went into the Mostel archive and was reading Zero Mostel's letters to Philip Loeb as he was going through this. And so much of it didn't have to do with Gertrude that it's not in the book, but just reading through, they were such good friends, and like reading men telling each other dirty jokes in letters in the 1950s is a real treat. I highly recommend it. There were so many. I was like, I'm definitely not including that. And there was a story about how he once called and they invited, the Mostels invited him over for dinner, and he called and asked something like, what should I wear? And, nothing, don't worry about it. And he actually supposedly came over naked. So that is the kind of guy. He was not like that around Gertrude, because he knew better. He was not going to mess around with Gertrude, but he had a really funny and dirty sense of humor. And it was fun to read all of those letters. And that was definitely like a road I did not need to go down in the book.
That's the great thing about research, all these marvelous rabbit holes that you find, and you just can't stop yourself.
Absolutely. And these women also just, their lives outside, a lot of their story takes place outside of TV. So Hazel had a lot of other stuff that went on in her life that I didn't get into as much, that kind of thing as well, because I was really focused on this time and in television. But I highly, I recommend all the rabbit holes with these stories, because it's very, Gertrude had a whole lifetime on radio before I even got to her. So just, there's so much to enjoy about their lives, and it's so inspiring to read about them.
So Jennifer, why don't you leave us with the name of a woman we should all go and look up and read more about, a woman who didn't make it into your book. Maybe it broke your heart to have to leave her out.
I mean, I think that Faye Emerson, you can read about her. She was the talk show host, and Amanda Randolph, who I mentioned a little bit, but she was fascinating as well, and kind of had different philosophies about roles to take and how to manage her career than like a Hazel Scott. She actually made a joke when she got her talk show, her daytime talk show. she was paid very low. I can't remember the exact amount. And someone asked her about it in an interview, and she said, well, for $5 a week, what do they expect? Hazel Scott? So, you know, she really had a sense of humor and seemed like a very fun woman. And I enjoyed reading about her, but didn't get all of it in there as well.
Maybe the next book.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, there's plenty there. There really is.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for spending your evening with us. And everyone, if you're not enticed to read the book, we're looking for When Women Invented Television. Please order it from bookshop.org or your favorite online platform for your favorite independent bookstore. Jennifer, this has been a delight. You know that you and I could probably go on and on about TV, but we have to let the folks at home go back to doing something other than watching us, maybe watching good TV.
That's right.
Good night, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us.